could not guarantee that the Chinese bodyguards of Jiang Zemin would not shoot demonstrators from Tibet on the spot.
China's occupation has been ongoing, at times extremely brutal. Repression is strong and intense, and in 1988, Hu Jintao, now president of China but then party secretary in Tibet, launched a particularly repressive period of martial law in which many monks and nuns were imprisoned merely for calling for an independent Tibet. Many Tibetans, due to the brutality of China's occupation, have been following the Dalai Lama into exile. Any year, between about 2,000 and 3,000 Tibetans flee over the Himalayas in really nothing more than the clothes that they stand in, risking snow blindness, frostbite, walking in very basic clothes and shoes. And that is purely because the repression in Tibet is so bad, and because parents of children want their children to grow up in Dharamsala, in exile, where they still may be able to learn the Tibetan language in order to preserve Tibetan culture and religion.
They're shooting them like dogs. Yeah.
In September 2006, foreign mountaineers who were climbing around Everest Base Camp happened to film the Chinese army kneeling down in the snow and from a distance opening up fire on a group of defenseless Tibetan refugees who were trying to flee from Tibet. That group included women and children.
I don't know what right the Chinese think they have to do things like this. There's no need to kill.
The question is survival. Can Tibet, for instance, survive as a Tibetan place? In fact, is there much left to save now? And in the same sense, can a movement like Falun Gong survive? Now, the advantage of Falun Gong is that, of course, it has many adherents outside China, and not just in Asia. So there will always be something. In the case of Tibet, Tibet is Tibet. It only exists there.
But then I'm worried, you see, because in the last few years, on one hand, they are engaged in meeting with us periodically. On the other hand, they had been systematically imposing all kinds of new rules and regulations, which seems to be definitely geared towards the very heart of Tibetan people's way of life, especially our religious tradition.
No one's seen him since, and he effectively became the world's youngest prisoner. The Chinese state is avowedly atheist, and therefore one would have to assume has no competence at all in what is essentially a very complicated, complex spiritual process by which reincarnated lamas are recognized. Bizarre on one level, but of course actually very cynical and very well thought out on the other. Effectively, it is saying we will be able to control the recognition of that Dalai Lama. And in doing that, it appropriates to itself the right to really determine Tibet's future political development.
Tibet is slowly being turned into a Chinese place. Tibetans have not abandoned their adherence to the Dalai Lama. They know that these are forms of belief and forms of activity which in fact are antithetical and dangerous to communism.
Tibetan political prisoners are routinely tortured in Tibet's jails.
They're surprised at the tenacity of these beliefs, but also they can, to a certain degree, smash them.
Democracy movement, Falun Gong, the pro-Taiwan independence group, that's in Taiwan, we call Taiwan Authority, and the Tibetan group, and also Eastern Turkestan group. 5 groups. All these groups are threats to the Chinese Communist government.
The Tibet issue is much more high profile. You have the Dalai Lama, so you have someone who is the West is sympathetic to.
Master Li is been an interesting character if you sort of compare him to, say, the Dalai Lama, who gets out there in the world constantly. Li Hongzhi is not that kind of man. He does not get out there in the world constantly. He does not go to Hollywood occasions. He's not made a big attempt to mix or to go down to Washington and lobby his case.
I think the Chinese government would behave much worse if there were no Dalai Lama. He had to go to the Archbishop of Canterbury's house to see the Dalai Lama, as if the Dalai Lama were a mere religious figure. And at Oxford, where there was a big public meeting involving the Dalai Lama, to which I went, the place that it was held, one of the Oxford college-like places, refused to allow any publicity about the name of that college, which I think I will now say, Rhodes House, because they thought that if the name Rhodes House were used and that the Dalai Lama had been there, that this would somehow annoy the Chinese. He became very defensive. Now, this is the very same Chris Patten who had been very openly critical of the Chinese for many years in Hong Kong, but appears now not to want that. It's the China magic again. Now he's the Chancellor of Oxford University, so we have to be careful how we criticize the Chinese in public.
If you ask me about the governments and why the governments are so reluctant to deal with these issues and so skeptical, I would tell you that money is involved. I would tell you that business is involved. I would tell you that there are some interests that governments are afraid of basically compromising. And if we were, because we need to be honest, if we were working for the government, we would be finding that we wouldn't bring out a lot of issues because they are not convenient. And I've seen that at the UN.
There are certain subjects which are absolutely off limit. I would say that Falun Gong is right up there at the top, along with Tibet. These things cannot be mentioned in the official in the media in China. Many Chinese think that Tibetans are ungrateful, and they probably would say that the Falun Gong are troublemakers.
They, at the same time, try systematically undermine Tibetan people's religious belief, our institutions.
But sorry to interrupt you, but can you see China's point of view? What they're actually saying to Tibet is by hanging on to these old traditions, you're restricting yourself from being part of that economic growth that China could offer you.
This is totally misleading.
They are forced to denounce the Dalai Lama. And if they don't denounce the Dalai Lama, the monastery or nunnery can be shut. Certainly the monk or nun will be expelled from their institution. It's an incredibly painful thing for a monk or nun to do, to denounce their root Lama, who is the root of all wisdom and all teaching. Much like it would be painful for a Roman Catholic to make an open denunciation of the Pope, or Jesus Christ, of course.
I was working at the UN during summer, and every day in front of the UN building you have this like, you know, like God bless them, the Tibet protesters, they were there like every day, whether it rain or no rain, they would be there. And I just have enormous amount of admiration for them.
Tibet support groups around the world were set up in the aftermath of Hu Jintao's particularly harsh crackdown in the late 80s. Westerners were in Tibet at the time, witnessed what happened and came back and decided they were going to try and do something.
China's persecution of anyone who dares to stand up and oppose the Chinese Communist Party is systematic. They torture you, they imprison you. In Tibet, mere possession of the Dalai Lama's photo will land you in prison for a period of maybe 10, 15 years.
We believe in the transformative power of public opinion, if you like, to change the way governments ultimately will engage with the Chinese government. I think movements have to just keep on going. They have to keep on growing their memberships. They have to try and bring this issue of China and what it does to its people to a wider and wider audience. An attack on Tibetan religion is not just an attack on a religion, it's an attack on a whole identity, a nation's identity. So when the Chinese authorities abducted the PANCHEN Lama, they didn't just steal a boy, they stole, if you like, the aspirations of a nation. And that's what we need to bring back.
It is true that resistance works, but it is also true that oppression works. And this is an old story.